Employee Resource Group. Thank you all for joining us today. I am so appreciative of Amber Johnson from Benedictine for reaching out and asking if Benedictine could host this collaborative ERG event. We have been in existence since 2015. Sandra Baker at the time worked for Northrop Grumman, and she decided to come together with other companies, the African American employee resource groups and business resource groups, and put together a professional development event. In 2017, she handed the baton to me, and I have been trying to do a decent job in bringing us together. Last year, we were not able to come together, but I am so happy that we are here. We are able to come together this year for this virtual event. So once again, thank you and welcome to our Intentional Inclusion event. And now I'm going to pass it over to Jim Laduma from Benedictine, the Director of Center for Values-Driven Leadership. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lakeisha. And on behalf of Benedictine University and the Center for Values-Driven Leadership, I just want to welcome all of you here today. And I want to extend a special word of welcome to those of you who are coming to this event via your local employee resource groups. It's a delight to have you here, and we're looking forward to an inspiring and informative session. Before we get started, just a couple of details. First, I would ask that you please keep yourself on mute and turn off your cameras. This will allow us to keep our focus and attention on our keynote speaker, Dr. Courtney McCluney. In terms of the agenda for this session, in just a minute, I'll introduce Dr. McCluney. Then she'll take over and lead us through her presentation on intentional inclusion and what that means now, today, and throughout this disruptive season in which we currently find ourselves. And along the way, Dr. McCluney will make time for breakout group discussions, and so be prepared for that. And then she'll also save time at the end for a Q&A session. And you can hold your questions until the Q&A session or send them at any time via chat to Lakeisha Morris, who will be moderating the Q&A session once we get to it. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Courtney McCluney. Courtney is an assistant professor of organizational behavior at Cornell University. She holds a PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan and did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Darden School of Business, University of Virginia. As a researcher, Dr. McCluney is focused primarily on marginalization and what keeps those on the margins of an organization from reaching the center where the power and resources reside, which of course brings us to our topic today, intentional inclusion, designing inclusive organizations for 2021. So Courtney, welcome. We are absolutely delighted to have you here with us today. And I'd like to now turn it over to you to get things started. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laduma, and to Amber and all of you at the Center for Values-Driven Leadership for this invitation. I am extremely grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you all about a very important topic, and one, as Dr. Laduma was saying, is especially relevant for workplaces today. So welcome to all of you. Hope that you're all staying warm. And I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you all. So when I thought about this topic and what it means to have intentional inclusion, I really wanted to deepen the understanding of the terms that we are using today. So first, there's this notion of what is intentional. And I went quite literal with this term, but I think it's helpful for us to think about in terms of what organizations can and should be doing around inclusion today. So here are some of the definitions of intentional that I found. It means done on purpose, deliberate, purposeful, pre-planned, willful, and volitional, which means of will. So when we think about a lot of the efforts around inclusion and diversity in the workplace, I would like for you all to question or ponder, to what extent do you find that your organization's actions and efforts are deliberate, purposeful, or even pre-planned? On the other side of that is this notion of inclusion, which has many different definitions and conceptualizations, especially in the academic world. But I just want to select a few keywords and insights that I think really help to bring this concept to light. One way of understanding inclusion is how it treats diversity. And what I like to think about when it comes to inclusive behaviors and actions and programs is that it thinks of diversity as a resource and really is something that should be celebrated and valued. Also recognize, instead of trying to treat everyone the same, but really seeing their unique differences as a strength. Inclusion can also be designed to empower everyone as a full participant and contributor of their workplace, and ensure that everyone has a voice in sharing their opinions on what's going on, either for workplace processes or on any issues that they deem relevant. I also think that the concept of equity is particularly relevant for inclusive conversations, one that a lot of organizations have not yet figured out how to address because it often is seen as an opposition with equality. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the final dimension of inclusion that I think is super relevant for a lot of my work on code switching is on authenticity. And to what extent does your organizational environment encourage these behaviors and experiences for all employees at work? As Dr. Laduma mentioned in the introduction, we are living in very interesting times where the need for intentional inclusion is extremely high for organizations. In this past year alone, we have witnessed some of the most extreme forms of violence targeting Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx communities. And because we live in a broken system, one in which inequality is rampant, we've also noticed that this deadly coronavirus has disproportionately impacted those same communities. We're also seeing deep political divides that are often driven by racial beliefs in superiority and supremacy. And we're seeing protests throughout our nation for us to come together and figure out ways to address inequality and inequity and move forward as a more united states. So I wanted to think today about how it is that employees may respond to a lot of these events that are occurring in society that are quite disruptive, and also the way that organizations respond. So several years ago, in the summer of 2016, some of my colleagues and I, all of us are graduate students at the time, wrote a paper that described how we felt in July of 2016 after Philando Castile and Alton Sterling were murdered by police within 24 hours of each other. We all felt this need to call in Black to work. We identified this concept from a popular YouTuber who gave a somewhat of a humorous video, but ultimately was talking about this feeling of vicarious trauma from witnessing yet another form of police violence that took the life of a Black person. And vicarious trauma is studied within psychology research and is shown that witnessing violence against a member of your own community can contribute to your own psychological and physiological stress, which compounded over time can lead to disparate health outcomes and cardiovascular issues, which we also know is disproportionately affecting Black communities and other marginalized communities. So this desire to call in Black was really an effort on our behalf and on the behalf of other people to try to find a space where we can heal and reclaim our humanity, especially in a space that we deem as safe. And at the time, our academic institutions did not seem like a safe space, partly because they weren't yet recognizing how we might be feeling because of this trauma that we had witnessed during this week in July. This could be a reflection of anti-Blackness, which is deeply embedded in our society. And it ultimately means not being able to recognize Black people's humanity, pain, and despair. Unfortunately, this is also embedded within our organizational cultures, where we tend to have a very reluctant view to discuss race at work. And if we do so, we tend to talk about it in a more global sense as opposed to specific racial groups. So when it comes to the issues that we've observed in our society today, especially around racial injustice, a lot of companies responded similar to Amazon. If they were large for-profit companies, we've seen public pledges to donate millions of dollars towards supporting justice and equity. Some of these donations went directly to historically Black colleges and universities. Others went to majority Black neighborhoods or community centers. And a lot of these pledges are expected to continue over time. However, all of these external focused efforts really led me to question to what extent was Amazon or other companies practicing intentional inclusion. Within the company itself, a lot of activists pointed out that for Amazon to claim that they value Black lives, they haven't done so when it comes to their products. So one activist pointed out in this story, it is opportunistic of Amazon to use this moment to make empty and hypocritical statements when it is building the backbone of many police forces and police departments around the country, said Jacinta Gonzalez of Mi Gente, a grassroots organization in California. The company perpetuates policies and technologies that are clearly targeting and harming Black communities. Here she is referencing a facial recognition software that Amazon has since put on hold since there has been public backlash against their support of police departments, given that this facial recognition technology disproportionately recognizes Black faces as criminal and could therefore exacerbate ongoing inequalities when it comes to police violence in Black communities. We're also noticing amongst Amazon's workers that the organization itself is not prioritizing worker well-being and health. So since 2016, the company has implemented lots of new methods of tracking productivity, which according to workers trying to organize a union in Alabama, is actually contributing to their physical exhaustion and burnout. They're hoping to inspire other Amazon warehouses to organize, but the company has over time demonstrated a lot of hostility and disdain for having worker unions. So what I took away from these examples, and Amazon is just one company, we can think of any different company that is at that scale and the ways that they may not be practicing intentional inclusion. It led me to start questioning what intentional inclusion is not. And again, I took the words at face value and tried to understand how their opposite meaning of something not done on purpose or deliberate or pre-planned is actually characteristic of most organizations today. We often think of this as performative allyship, where companies are publicly displaying their support of social justice movements, and especially for racial justice, but are actually not demonstrating that those efforts internal to the company. This has also been termed as wokeism. And instead of being pre-planned and deliberate, a lot of inclusion efforts tend to be reactionary. Something happens, the public is wondering why a company hasn't made a statement, and then they release a statement, as opposed to the company actually organizing and planning around trying to address and create anti-racist organizations. Some of these efforts also seem forced. As I said before, a lot of this is coming from external pressures of individuals who are in social movements, as opposed to something that is embraced and welcome in the organization. All of this can, of course, contribute to ultimate exclusion of people of color inside the organization and Black people in particular. And a lot of scholars are starting to notice this with the ongoing business case for diversity arguments. So this was in the 90s, one of the main reasons why companies were promoting or actually complying to affirmative action legislation. We could demonstrate that having a diverse workforce actually contribute to the creativity and the productivity of organizations. However, the extended period of time that we have tried to tout the business case for diversity is unfortunately commodifying the experiences of people of color and therefore not thinking of diversity as valuable unless it increases your bottom line. This is also where we're seeing individuals wanting to be treating everyone equally instead of equitably. So rather than addressing past harms that have disproportionately affected Black people and other people of color in various ways, companies would like to gloss over and start from now treating everyone the same. This also looks like taking a colorblind approach where we don't recognize differences, but instead try to mold people into a one culture of our organization. This often occurs through assimilation, which is this pressure that some employees feel forget and shed any uniqueness about themselves or their cultural identity if it doesn't fit within the dominant cultural group of the organization. So when I say assimilate, a lot of my research has explored how people have been forced to assimilate to what it means to be a professional at work. And this concept of professionalism on the surface may not seem harmful or that it could contribute to exclusion. But in a broken society that is informed and created by racist systems, professionalism is also often coded for white, middle class, heterosexual, able bodied men. And they are the ones who also tend to determine what it means to be professional because they have been in positions of power for so long. And that means that a certain segment of the population will be disproportionately affected by notions of professionalism. What my colleagues and I have observed in our research is that this pressure to assimilate to workplace culture and to feel that you have to be a professional by meeting standards that are determined by white, heterosexual, able bodied men would ultimately encourage them or motivate them to engage in what we coin code switching. This is not a new concept, especially for marginalized groups of people, but the way that we think about it in our work, which we've primarily explored with Black people in professional workplaces, is that code switching is a strategy for Black people to survive and successfully navigate interracial situations and interactions. We primarily focus on the workplace, but these situations and interactions can also occur in society, such as when interacting with police. The ways in which people engage in code switching is by adjusting their style of speech, such as their tone, vocal intonation, or maybe even the vernacular of words that they're using. Their appearance, which we most often see in the workplace as changing your hairstyle, whether you wear it in a more Eurocentric straight style or in a natural hairstyle, such as locks or afros. And any sort of behavioral expression, whether that's if you talk with your hands or not. And the reason why people are engaging in these code switching behaviors is to optimize the comfort of other people in their environment. And in the workplace, this is most often the other people who are members of the dominant group, because the more that you can assimilate to their cultural norms, the more likely you are to receive fair treatment, quality service, and opportunities such as jobs or promotion. So my colleagues and I explored the various consequences or costs that are associated with code switching at work. And we also looked at different behavioral dimensions of code switching. So one of those is downplaying one's racial identity group membership. So trying not to act like other members of my racial group or possibly wanting to separate or distinguish yourself from other people. So the less that someone presents themselves as member of the Black racial group, whether that's by how you speak or the things that you claim interest in, the more likely it increases perceptions of your professionalism at work. Indeed, leaders have been associated with attributes and traits that are most akin to white men. This would also increase your likelihood of being hired. Sonia Kang and colleagues found that Black and Asian students were actually whitening their resumes, taking off any sort of identifiers of their race, changing their names, all sorts of things to downplay their membership into racial groups. And this would increase their number of callbacks to jobs. The consequences of engaging in these behaviors, however, is that oftentimes people may be accused of acting white, which could contribute to their feelings of inauthenticity by their intra-group racial peers. Individuals also seek to avoid stereotypes. And again, because we primarily study this amongst Black people, we were looking at the extent to which people would work twice as hard so that they avoid stereotypes that they may be lazy or incompetent. Of course, when you put in more hours of work, it increases your perceptions of leadership ability or dedication and commitment to your company. And this might also contribute to high performance, especially because most often the credentials that Black people have do not garner the same outcomes as their white peers. So a lot of people are overqualified for the jobs that they're in, which usually means that they are going to meet and exceed performance expectations. However, seeking to avoid stereotypes and managing how it is that you present yourself at work could be emotionally and cognitively taxing, which ultimately contributes to burnout. I was part of this research team at Catalyst that first explored the emotional tax amongst Black women and men in the United States. And we are seeing this pattern over and over again amongst minorities in Canada as well. The final way that people could code switch at work through behavioral, appearance, and vocal modifications is by expressing interest with the dominant group. This included things like saying that I am interested in golf or other sorts of hobbies. Also, I forgot to mention at the beginning that someone will remind me when I have 5 minutes left, so please do not be alarmed when they come into the conversation. So by expressing interest with the dominant group, individuals are able to promote similarity with dominant group members. And the similarity attraction paradigm is a particularly strong element of our human experience, where we like people who remind us of ourselves. And if people in power are impressed by you, it increases your chance of being promoted because you fit in with that cultural group experience. However, the downsides of expressing interest in the dominant group is that it could create unrealistic expectations for all Black employees, that all of you are capable of engaging in these behaviors or liking these interests. It also could minimize beliefs that discrimination and exclusion exist. I most often think of this with our former President Barack Obama, where after his election, a lot of people assumed that we were in a post-racial society because if a Black man could achieve the highest level of office, then we shouldn't have any other issues when it comes to ascending into leadership roles. And we all saw how that ended.
3 or 4 minutes before.
Thank you, Amber. So in this last part, I want to quickly discuss how it is that other people might evaluate code switching behaviors. So my colleagues and I designed an experiment where we asked people to imagine that they are receiving advice from a Black person at a law firm. This person either told them that I am engaging in code switching behaviors, I'm changing my name, my hairstyle, how I speak in order to fit in at work, or I'm not doing any of these things. I'm going to keep my Afrocentric hairstyles. I'm going to keep speaking how it is that I naturally speak and not change my name. If I have a Black sounding name, I'm going to keep it rather than choosing a more white sounding name. And we looked at this amongst Black and white participants, and this is what we found. Black women and men evaluated the non-code switching employee as more professional, more likely to succeed at work, and they also thought of them as more authentic and more likable, possibly because of that similarity attraction paradigm. They also think that the person should keep their Black sounding name and felt most strongly that Black people should wear their natural hair as opposed to changing it. As you can imagine, we actually found the opposite effect for white participants. White women and men evaluated the code switching employee as more professional and more likely to succeed at work instead of the non-code switching employee. Surprisingly, they also prefer that the person keep their own Black sounding name and speak standard English at work, similar to the Black participants. So this helped us identify how some areas of code switching could have a universal response and others could have an opposite effect, such as the experience with hair. So white people, and white women in particular, felt most strongly that Black people should change their hairstyles at work and not wear natural hair. One quote we have from a white participant said, "Nappy hair does not belong in the workplace. It is unprofessional." As you can imagine, we are also in a different type of work environment where we are doing this engagement virtually and people are working from home. We wonder to what extent working from home would also exacerbate code switching experiences, especially because home was considered a private, safe space. And now it is merging with an area where Black people typically code switch. This could be exacerbated because a lot of managers are starting to monitor and track the productivity of their employees through watching them through a virtual screen. And feeling like you're being watched, also having the ability to see yourself, could increase concerns about whether or not people feel professional at home. So we surveyed approximately 140 Black remote workers in September of 2020 and found that they are code switching more than when they were working in the office. They are code switching more now that they work from home, and this is associated with increased levels of burnout and exhaustion at work. I have my own timer set. So this is a great time for us to now switch into the breakout groups. Given a lot of what I've shared today, I have a couple of questions for you all. So using this intentional inclusion framework, a purposeful, deliberate act in order to increase the contributions and participation of employees and valuing their differences, I encourage you all in your breakout groups to discuss at least one of the following questions. How does your work environment encourage and reward Black employees for code switching? How might leaders proactively engage in inclusion instead of reactionary? But what are the consequences of this? And finally, what might an inclusive remote work strategy look like? So with that, I think Amber is going to put you all into breakout rooms. And when you come back, we will have time for some Q&A. I hope that you all had really helpful conversations. I know many of you are probably cut off mid-sentence. I think that is how breakout rooms are designed. Wait until someone's saying something quite profound and then shut out. Before we go into Q&A, I want to quickly share some resources with you all, and I will share these slides with the Center for Values-Driven Leadership so that they can email out later. But first are a couple of readings and reports that I think do a fantastic job of deepening the conversation, especially a lot of the questions that you all just had. First, there's the book Race, Work, and Leadership, New Perspectives on the Black Experience that I contributed to and was edited by Dr. Laura Morgan Roberts, Anthony Mayo, and David Thomas, who's the president of Morehouse College. There's also a full series in the Harvard Business Review Big Idea series on a racially just workplace. And this is where my colleagues and I first out the notion of code switching at work. As I mentioned in the presentation, there's work on the emotional tax and how to affect Black women and men at work at Catalyst. And I thought that this was a great piece in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on bias of professionalism standards. A lot of what we discussed today around code switching really comes from how it is that people are defining professionalism. Also wanted to share my contact information in case we don't have time for that in the Q&A. I know we can get lost in the questions. So I'm super active on Twitter. You're welcome to follow me there. I also have a website, and that is an L in the middle, so CourtneyLMcCluney.com. If you would like to follow up with me, that is how I recommend you getting in touch. So now we'll go to Q&A, and I will stop sharing slides and encourage you to turn on your cameras. And I know that where Lakeisha is going to moderate the Q&A.
Yes, and so if you all have questions, you can please add them to the chat, and I will, you can send it directly to me or you can put it to everyone, whichever works best for you.
I just realized too, I wasn't sharing my screen that whole time. Sorry, everyone. So these are Zoom issues. So here's those resources I talked about again, and there's my contact information again one more time. Sorry about that.
And we can send these out afterwards.
Yes, thank you. Now I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Okay, so that was one of the questions. Is there a link to the slide? So we've we've done that. Here's a question. From your research, what do you find white people can do to support their Black colleagues? And then I'll ask the next question later. So go ahead with that one.
Yes, a lot of the energy and excitement this summer was really, I was really hopeful after witnessing how much white people were encouraged to educate themselves and put into practice a lot of what they were learning about becoming anti-racist people themselves. So I'd hope that that is continuing. I know that our attention span wanes and a lot of people thought that racism ended when the election happened. But I do hope that they remember how deeply systemic these problems are, and it requires a lot of work on behalf of white people doing their part. So of course, educating, but then also in the workplace, I really would like for there to be more time for reflection before action and words. So oftentimes, I think whenever there's conversations around racial justice and equity at work, I see one of two reactions from white people. It is either extreme apologizing and I'm so scared, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to do. And that doesn't actually help anything, right?
Yeah.
It's more wanting to assuage your own guilt. And the other reaction is one of defensiveness. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't own, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like there, I think it can go far left. So between those two extremes, though, I think there's a lot of room for humanity and a lot of room for reflection, for people to pause and really think, what is the goal that I'm trying to accomplish here? If my goal is to be anti-racist, what's the first step? What's the second? And to keep moving forward, knowing that you're going to make mistakes along the way, but see that as opportunities for learning instead of a space for punishment. And of course, at a collective level, this could look like advocating for equal pay. We know that the racial gap is just as wide as the gender gap, and even more so for men of color too. Really, the gender gap is really with white men. So advocating on behalf of all employees of color, and when you see issues of microaggressions, speaking out and calling attention to that. and really taking the onus on you to change this workplace and to change all the cultural norms that would pressure someone to feel that they have to assimilate and code switch.
Just a follow-up question, because this does happen with our allies, right? So they'll come, someone may come to a Black person and say, you know, I didn't know this was happening, da, da, da. And because of now we may feel free to express just everything, right? There may be lashing out. So how do we, as Black people, not lash out, right, to those who are trying to figure out how to even approach the subject?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. I definitely think my colleagues and I are actually working on a piece right now called a recovery guide for Black people at work, where oftentimes, especially prior to summer 2020, a lot of organizations, Black people had to deal with the racism in silence and really
Mhm.
keep it to themselves. And now it's a topic of public conversation. And there seems to be this dual pressure to be educated by Black people and not overburden them with that education at the same time.
Yeah,
So I'm hoping that organizations are creating lots of opportunities for Black people to recover and rest from engaging in all of this additional diversity work, also compensating them for their time and work in this, and also giving them room to say no. This is where hiring ongoing training from people whose job it is to do this would be really helpful, because if you're going to expect your Black employees to still perform at a high level for the tasks that they are hired to do and do this educational work, that's a lot of ask. So part of why I think Black people are lashing out is because they're exhausted. So creating room for people to rest and recover, and also to say no, that this is not their job, right? To educate folks. And you know, what I've also learned from my code switching research is a lot of the reasons why people do it or how they're able to do it so well is that a lot of people of color in this country have been forced to learn and adapt to white culture. And I think what has to happen now in order for white people to be the best allies that they can is to learn more about the cultures that you've never been forced to learn, to become a student of that, right? And to really think of this learning opportunities moving forward. I think that would be even better, so that there's more learning and education on your own. So many resources out there for people to engage with too. And companies have to make room and space for white people to do this work as well, right? Like there also needs to
absolutely.
be dedicated time for deepening learning. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. Harold Townsend has a question, and his question is, based on your research, what advice or guidance do you have for Black employees and leaders in organizations that are not demonstrating intentional inclusiveness?
For Black employees and leaders who are not doing this.
It's what advice do you have or guidance do you have for Black employees and leaders in organizations that are not yet demonstrating intentional inclusiveness?
Yes. Well, I would question a couple of things. One, we do know, unfortunately, from research that white women and people of color who advocate for gender and racial issues, respectively, are penalized in organizations, but white men are not for advocating on behalf of diversity. So part of why we might be witnessing members of marginalized groups not engaging in intentional inclusion behaviors is because they're trying to protect themselves. There could be backlash or a perception that you have an agenda or you are being biased towards your own group if you're advocating on behalf of these issues. So this is where we really need the people in power to step up. So that could be one of the reasons why they may not be engaging in intentional inclusion, especially if they're one of few or the only one at their particular level. If every time I come into the room, I'm going to bring up issues about Black women at work, over time, I might not be invited to many rooms anymore. Granted, that is my job. So I hope people know this when they hire me, that is what I'm here to do. But for other people, that may not be the case. So that's what I would question about that. They may not be performing intentional inclusion because it's not safe to do so.
Okay. I have another question, Allison, from Allison Rojas. It seems like many efforts from philanthropy focus on throwing money at the problem. What might be better alternatives?
Yes, I have been thinking about this a lot. There has been a sort of charitable response, which is rooted in benevolent racism and sexism, right? To think that we have to donate money because these poor people can't do for themselves, instead of identifying the system that keeps people dependent on philanthropy. as opposed to investing in communities and resources where they can eventually have the means to take care of themselves if we address the root cause of their marginalization. So I think a better solution for a lot of companies is thinking about their stock and where and how they are investing that or giving people stock options. I know reparations is currently on the table right now, and this is not the first time the US has issued reparations. Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II, placed into internment camps, received reparations for that. So it is possible for the US government to think about creative ways of engaging in reparations. And from a company level, one of the ways that they can do it is by thinking about giving stock options to people who are in their surrounding neighborhoods, communities of color, and our history in terms of where a lot of the money came from for a lot of these families that started companies. We have all of that documentation. There could be like direct lines of reparations for a lot of these private companies. I know in Europe right now, all of the ships that carried enslaved people from the shores of the African continent to various parts of the world, all of that documentation is coming to light, and they are linking them to present day people and companies as a way of showing how and why you owe reparations to people. We can also think about this from a redlining perspective too, when it comes to housing and all the banks that benefited from not allowing people to have bank loans with reasonable rates in certain neighborhoods. And this, of course, is happening well into the housing crisis of 2008. So I think that the investment, the reparations argument needs to be more on the table instead of the philanthropy, because we do keep seeing the throwing the money out, which is not a deliberate pre-planned action of inclusion. It's more reactionary and it's more performative.
Thank you. Another question from Clifton Mason. Did your research bring out any differences in the generations, white and or Black?
Yes, that is a great question. Thank you so much for asking. What we are finding is previous generations of Black people were so unaware that they were code switching that it was difficult for them to even identify or endorse code switching behaviors. Also, probably because they've been doing it for such a long time. There was also generational differences with white respondents as well, where I'd say still around millennial, unfortunately, millennial to baby boomer work generation of white people had these more stereotype beliefs. So we are seeing with the latest, the incoming generation of the workforce, way more openness and tolerance of differences, at least on the surface. But unless structural things change, I wonder to what extent this new generation will be assimilated to believe that this is what a leader looks like if our current leadership doesn't change. And these are the expectations that we should hold people to when it comes to professional appearance and speech, because they are coming in at the bottom of organizations and they will be influenced by who is at the top.
Awesome. Here's a question. It's kind of circling back to one of our previous questions, and it is, what would you say to someone who does say, I never did anything against Black people? The kind of person who says that if Obama could be elected, there is no more racism. So they're that same person. They say that, and then but they say they've never done anything against. What do you say? What's the response?
I would ask
And
them.
we have about 2 more minutes.
Thank you,
Okay.
Amber. I would quickly ask, what is your understanding of the term racism? It sounds like you're thinking of it as an individual one-to-one negative behavior as opposed to a systemic structural issue where by me being a Black person, there are certain things in life that I will have to deal with and face, and certain things that my family had to go through just because we were Black, that other groups will not, that you as a white person or whatever group, you would have a different life experience. So I'd really engage them around how it is that they're defining racism and how has that definition led them to this understanding.
And then I'll just take this last question here. It's from John Fredette. I do apologize if I mispronounced your name. He's from Nokia, and he's saying he's a member of Nokia's LGBTQ employee resource group. And his deepest goal is to create a workplace, a workspace in which everyone can be their authentic selves. Let's see, he now realizes that is a goal that goes beyond just LGBTQ individuals. Can you share in our respective goals to allow everyone to be their authentic self? So how can how can everyone, what is a goal that would be more inclusive, right? To go beyond that ERG.
Sure. And I think, for some ERGs, some elements of people's identity may or may not be as visible as others, right? And so the type of code switching looks differently. What I find with mostly LGBTQ identified persons is that it's all around disclosure. To what extent do I disclose this element of my identity? Whereas I don't have to disclose that I'm a Black woman, right? Like you can see that, and whatever sort of treatment I receive is on that plane. So an intentionally inclusive organization would think about, to what extent have we created a safe space for someone to be themselves and have the agency to disclose or not disclose, to speak with African-American vernacular English or not, to wear my hair as natural hair or not. I think that should be the goal, that I have choices on how it is I present myself at work, and those choices do not prohibit me from leadership opportunities or a negative performance evaluation.
Absolutely. Well, it is, we are at that time where we are at the end of our Q&A session. So thank you all for your questions. Amber, are we going to send these questions to Dr. McCluney and have her answer and then send the answers back out?
Well, I'll definitely send them to her, and
Okay.
what happens from there, that'll be her choice. But we'll make sure we get you her resource list, which I'm guessing
Absolutely.
addresses a lot of these questions as well.
Absolutely.
And I think now we're turning it over to Jim.
Yes.
Thank you all.
Very good. Well, thank you. And thank you, Lakeisha, for leading us through this session today. It has been tremendously rich. And Dr. McCluney, thank you for your research and your work and for joining us today and for walking us through your concepts and your knowledge. So much to think about, so much more to learn, so much more to do. And we appreciate you spending time with us today to help us along that path. As we close, I want to let all of you know that if you love research and learning like you just did with Dr. McCluney, you may want to consider earning your PhD in leadership. And here at Benedictine University, we offer a PhD in values-driven leadership for senior executives, and our next cohort starts April 8th. So if you're interested, get in touch right away with my colleague, Amber Johnson. Or go to our website, and those resources are in the chat. I also want to invite you to join us at our upcoming webinars. We do one free executive education seminar a month, like this one today. And in March, we'll be talking about using appreciative inquiry as a process for leading positive change in organizations. And then in April, our colleagues Enrique Lopez and Elizabeth Salamanca will continue our series on diversity, equity, inclusion, and leadership with a session on the challenges and opportunities of Latinx leadership and how we can develop Latinx leaders at every level in our organizations. And again, Amber is sharing a link on the screen where you can find out more information. And so to bring us to a close, I just want to thank you, Lakeisha, once again for your work in coordinating today's event and for your work as chair of the collaborative ERG. And I want to thank you once again, Dr. McCluney, for your excellent presentation, work, and research to help inform us today. And Lakeisha, let me now turn it over to you to wrap things up.
Thank you so much, Jim. I just want to thank Dr. McCluney again. You've done an excellent job today. We're so appreciative of your insight, and I'm looking forward to just looking at some of your resources and sending that out to everyone. Thank you, Amber and Jim, for hosting today's event. We are so appreciative of you all reaching out and agreeing to be the host for this year. And then I want to thank all of the African American ERG leaders others that are a part of the collaborative, such companies as Argonne, BMO, Ecolab, Fermilab, Molex, Navistar, Nokia, R.R. Donnelly. Thank you so much, and thank you for, there's another university online as well, DePaul. Thank you all for attending as well. I'm just so appreciative, and all the other people who represent different companies. Thank you for answering the call and sending out the word about this event. We are truly appreciative of you joining us. So I thank you again. You all have a wonderful and blessed day, and we look forward to having another session next year. Have a good
Thank you
one.
all so much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.